China-Colombia relationship in the 21st century went from zero to multi-billion dollars within a decade. However, despite its apparent successes, the relationship is largely a story of failure. With me to discuss is Sabrina from SOAS University of London. Well, Sabrina, how can a multi-billion dollar bilateral trade relationship be a failure?
Even though there's been a massive increase in trade, which is what you see for all of Latin America and China, any bilateral initiative, so the actual relationship part, has failed. So trade deals, economic deals, overall economic deals, diplomatic efforts have borne very little fruit.
Do they actually need each other, the two countries?
One of China's hallmarks is infrastructure development, and something you've seen all over the continent of Africa. In very basic terms, they develop up the infrastructure and then they take out resources. And Colombia has a crying need for infrastructure development. China is not their only source of funding for this. The US has been one of their largest sources of aid. That's primarily been for Plan Colombia. But you also have a lot of other institutions in there that Colombia can get better rates from. It's less about the cost of not doing business and more about the missed opportunity.
So the relationship between Colombia and China, is this typical of other Latin American countries with China?
It's actually a bit atypical. So on paper, it looks typical in that trade has gone up. China really had a concerted policy effort to go into the entire region, and they followed through very clearly. And countries like Venezuela and Ecuador had their own way of responding to this wholeheartedly, and really in favor of China over America. Quite clearly, it was a choice between the two for those two countries, I think. And Colombia is more patterns itself more after sort of open market policies and is more inclined to go along with Chile and countries like that. But Chile had a very concerted, organized effort of engaging the Chinese, of getting a free trade agreement through, and Colombia didn't really do any of that.
Well, as you said earlier, there are glaring opportunities for Chinese investment in terms of development in Colombia, but these haven't borne fruit. So why exactly is this?
There are a lot of reasons, and it depends on each infrastructure investment case. There's one case that people haven't been talking about called Nueva Shenzhen, and the reason why they haven't been talking about it is because it stopped dead in the water. So it was a massive project to develop an airport, a regional hub for Latin America, in addition to golf courses and resorts, and to really revitalize a part of the Pacific coast in Colombia. They were hoping that it would be a strategic location for China to enter in through the rest of the continent. They negotiated this for a long time. They had Ricardo Bofill from Spain draw up all the plans for it. They had a lot of money invested in this, and by they I mean the actual Nueva Shenzhen project itself. And in the end, the Colombian courts denied the land acquisition, even though at the time President Uribe was one of the people spearheading this. So I think China's used to doing a lot of top-down deals, and in Colombia it doesn't fit for that legal environment.
Well, when it comes to the China Development Bank, I would have thought Colombian development is exactly the kind of project they'd be interested in. And of course, the Chinese Development Bank is meant to be a rival to the World Bank. So do you think they've fallen short, or is it actually Colombia who's to blame?
There were two issues, I think, with infrastructure development that I heard throughout my interviews. And the two issues that the Colombians brought up were, the first one was that the CDB sets rates in a regional area, and so it will give similar rates to Ecuador and Venezuela as it would for Colombia. But Colombia has a very different business environment, and it can get better rates elsewhere. The second aspect was that when there's infrastructure development, there's a big question as to who do you employ to physically build that infrastructure. And in Colombia, if it's not Colombians, they're much less interested. So even if it's cheaper overall and you can get the infrastructure built, they want to make sure it's their people building it.
Now, Colombia and China have been discussing a free trade deal, which in itself sounds promising, but do you think it's likely to happen?
Just recently, they've been renegotiating this and bringing it back on the table. There was a lot of opposition within Colombia to the free trade agreement, a lot of fear on the part of the industrial organizations. So I don't know how it's going to go at this point, but I think things have changed in the country quite a bit. And that's mostly in relation to how Colombia has been working with its neighbors facing China.
Some assert that the Colombian government lacks a discernible foreign policy towards China, but you don't agree. Why?
So there hasn't been success in bilateral initiatives, which would make you think that the Colombians have been turning their back on China. But if you look at the rhetoric, you look at the efforts that Uribe and Santos have put into signing deals and meeting with very high-level officials in China and in Colombia, and even going to Peru to make sure that they meet the right Chinese officials when they're visiting there. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that there's been this effort and then no follow-through, and I think that's the issue. There was no follow-through. So they were keen to negotiate an FTA, but then they didn't follow up. And one of the reasons has been domestic opposition, I think. Another reason is lack of interest. Part of me is just wondering if it's because Colombia doesn't like to say no. So they're open to everybody, and then in the end they'll just pick who they want to work with and what's best for them. But that's very different from saying we don't like China, or we only follow the US, or we only follow China. It's not quite as polemic, I think.
So overall, do you think this situation can change, and what do you think really needs to be done?
I do think the situation is changing, and one of the most exciting things that came out of my research is that where there have been bilateral successes, so it's not all failures, but where there have been successes, it's been because a third party has been involved, whether or not that third party is aware of it. So the biggest export from Colombia to China is petroleum. And it's a classic example of where I think the bilateral relationship has failed, because the only reason they're exporting it is because Colombia puts it to the market, and whoever buys it, and it happens to be that China's bought a significant amount. For Colombia, it's an insignificant amount for China. But every time a Chinese company has gone to bid on developing a Colombian oil field, they have an open bidding process for field development. Every single time they either fail to qualify for the bid, they fail the pre-qualification, or they just fail the bid completely. And so they haven't been able to enter into the Colombian process of oil field development, except for in the cases where they buy out another company. So Emerald Energy was a UK firm, and a Chinese state-owned enterprise bought Emerald Energy, and that's how they were able to start developing oil fields and sort of jumping over that bidding process that they were quite terrible at.